devil's been busy in your backyard.
Well, you know the devil has been busy in our backyard, friends. Yes, indeed. Just take a look at our country. Indeed. But there's a lot of people in the world that still love us, even though a lot of people think that we're kind of silly. Well, welcome back to 21st Century Radio. I'm Dr. Bob Hieronimus, our executive producer and research assistants, Laura Kortner, and our engineer is Anita Brockington. Our guest tonight is independent researcher of historical anomalies, Gary Gianotti. Gary Gianotti was born on the property of a Revolutionary War sea captain, and he's had an interest in both colonial history and the sea ever since. His father was a pioneer maritime electronics engineer, and Gary became a licensed merchant marine right out of high school. He has worked in the yachting industries, traveling from Maine to Florida and West Indies, where he took advantage of searching the libraries, museums, and archives all over the eastern seaboard to further his study of colonial history. He achieved his merchant master's license captain's papers, but following a near-death experience in 2004, he hung up his sea bag and married his high school sweetheart. Today, he enjoys solving historical and genealogical mysteries while working as a subcontractor with house and property maintenance. His goal is to contribute to society through restoring the lost origins of the national coat of arms and who was behind the true founding of America. Now that is something good to accomplish. I have asked him to rejoin us on 21st Century Radio to discuss his most recent findings on the Great Seal, the Washington Peace Medals, and the early American flag. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio, Gary.
Hey, how are you, Bob?
How's your pitching arm? Is it doing all right?
Pretty good. Not too bad.
Good going. I'm trying to develop mine. My screwball is not good, but my curve is fine. But we can't use it anyway, right? Because there's no baseball. Well, I understand you just got some forensic results on the Washington Peace Medals that have helped create a standard of how to identify authentic medals. Would you like to start there? How about start with what is a Washington Peace Medal and why are there only 15 to 20 authenticated when there are over 1,500 were made?
Sure. During the time of George Washington's presidency from 1789 until 1796, he issued important historical silver medals that he would give to important Indian chiefs in the effort, presenting them as gifts in an effort to create peace with the expansion of our country, moving out into the wilderness and going out west. And there were many issues in different sizes, and possibly it's documented about maybe 1,500 were made. And the front would have George Washington smoking a peace pipe with an Indian chief and having a tree. And then on the back, you'd have the bird as on the Great Seal of the dollar or our coat of arms. And so Washington would have these given out, and they were done in a series. And today, it's just no one had any understanding of the art, how to identify them, how to prove a real one from a fake one until recently in the last 7 years working on it. But in the last months, the pieces I've been associated with were sent out to a forensic lab. A very well-known scientist who did the studies on the stars and stripes for me that tested the dyes, authenticating and dating them. And boy, within a couple of days, he knew instantly, and we proved that most of the original medals, ones from burial sites, those are the ones, few of them are the ones that have been found, and they're in museums today, and a few in private collectors' hands. But the whole thing was no one's known how to identify these pieces. They don't know, so it's been a mystery.
Didn't some of the chiefs have some of them?
Correct. They were given to the chiefs in three sizes. The most important chiefs would get the largest ones, and then the next chief down would get a medium size medal, and then the war chiefs would get these smaller ones, all in the same similar design, made in 2 plates, and then a wire going around them. So the pieces were very complicated to make, and they do hold vast esoteric art within them. The oval design and the trees are supposedly what's being believed now represent Mother Earth. You remember the turtle in the tree that comes out of the back of the turtle? It's the symbol of the Indians for God, their God, Mother Earth. Yeah.
How did you learn to authenticate these?
Well, one of the big ones was when I was doing the Great Seal history work in the past, and we've talked. We were learning, my associates and I, David Fegley from out in Pennsylvania. We were working on the early Great Seals. I was, and then when he and I became friends, I was also tracking the history back to the gun makers that all worked for Robert Scott, the Great Seal makers company called the American Banknote Company. And so with the guns, we started to learn and find different marks because they were all a part of the money-making company of Robert Scott. So they all left their initials in different areas throughout the pieces. And that's very common that you'll find their initials when basically they weren't allowed to. But on a few of these medals, there's only a handful of this group that survive. They have a punch mark, not a hallmark. It's the initials letter marks called a touch mark, their initials. And those are the rarest pieces surviving today.
How many do you have you had?
A couple.
How did you get them? Tell us how you got them, because this is what the most interesting thing to me is how you discover these things, because you are very dedicated to this work.
Sure.
You know that there's a deeper message with all our symbols, etc., and that's one of the reasons why I think your work is so important.
Yeah, one of the big medals was that you have today is a big problem with the museums and auction houses. It's become so corrupted today that there are handfuls of people, and even in any collector's world out there with the big money, that are trying to buy and sell. Even if you've advanced research, a lot of these people are knocking down people that are the scholars trying to do the actual identification work. And so one person with name or notoriety out there will say, oh, this is fake. And then all of a sudden the whole thing's screwed up because these group of people want to be the authorities, even though they're not advancing anything. Mm-hmm. So in this case, real short, I had worked with a doctor, an engineer out of Charleston, South Carolina, who was doing the study on a piece. And we did a big write-up, and it was published in the American Numismatic Society Colonial Journal. It's the most prestigious coins and metal journal in the world. And you just don't get in there as a write-up. Most people don't even get in there in a lifetime to do a publication. And so this work that we had done did not meet the standard. It wasn't achieved yet that we were able to identify and prove everything. We were just advancing the information. And then at that time, this man who actually owned one of the piece, he was very old, elderly man, and he had given up on trying to authenticate the piece. And a good associate of mine and myself, we had purchased the metal in the effort that it would not be lost, because we knew that this specific hallmark, or not the hallmark, the punch mark with the letter marks, was only one of two with the punch marks existing in 1792. And that was exactly when the U.S. Mint was founded. And this artist was Joseph Wright, who was Benjamin Franklin's very, very close friend. His mother was Benjamin Franklin's spy. She was the first sculpturist artist in the United States who went to England, and Joseph Wright became the first American-born student to go to the Society in London for art. And then from there, he went to France and spent a year, and that's how he's the one that produced those famous paintings of Benjamin Franklin. So he was a painter. He worked on engravings, sculpture himself, very famous pieces that are in Mount Vernon and major museums. But the thing is that still these experts, they would not want to accept the punch marks being him. But until now that we've authenticated the pieces, showing that all the original pieces that are supposed to be solid silver are actually silver plated, the earliest silver plating in the United States. And so when they do XRF testing and X-ray fluorescence testing without damaging it, and it tells you what the percentage of what the metal is too, right? And the elements, they couldn't break through. No one was shooting through it deep enough to be able to find out about that they're plated. And this was done just by the microscope with the scientists. And it makes you wonder, how have some of the top numismatic scholars in the United States for nearly 100 years, 10 of the most important advanced scholars who wrote books on these, not able to even notice this? It's just, it's mind blowing.
It is mind blowing because I guess it has a lot to do with the difficulty of the task. Now, you're willing to take on very difficult tasks, right?
Sure. Oh yeah.
And you don't give up. You stay on top of it. And
you have to.
Now, I didn't mention Dr. Joseph Baraby. Is that did I mispronounce his name? Is that
no? You're correct. Yes,
Oh,
Dr. Baraby is semi-retired, and he's this renowned scientist who worked on ancient Bibles, testing the inks. He did the historical Ames flag, the only signed and dated flag. There was never a Stars and Stripes proven real in United States history until I worked on it with him in the science lab, and they tested everything, and everything was period to date. That the man who signed the flag, Nathaniel Ames, signed his flag in prison in Bermuda. A privateer sailor that was thrown in jail and then thrown into service for the British.
Well, this is important to our interpretations of the American history because, as you say, and we have really gotten into this yet, British citizens living in America at the time of the revolution would have chosen a side king. This is the first time I've heard this.
Correct.
And you say a number rejected the English King George in favor of Stuart kings from Scotland, who claimed to be the rightful heirs to the throne. Is this why you say all the most important symbols of our nation represent the Stuart cause to rule America?
It's factually true today. The American flag represents their identity as, for instance, Jesus and the 12 apostles. You have the king and the 12 knights, Thistle or Garter from England and Scotland. They were the heads of these special orders of knights that were the rulers of the realm with the king. Same with the Great Seal. The bird design represents the phoenix, and this is symbolic to the last prince attempting to take the throne back, named Charles Edward Stuart, the Bonnie Prince, in 1745. And his symbol was this phoenix, and you'll see it in his artwork as well. And same with the Pyramid of the Great Seal. It's not Egyptian. These men they sent out an explorer who did a study out in Africa, in Sudan, and the whole study was tracking down the bloodlines of Moses to see where their sovereignty comes from and their rights as rulers, as kings. So the pyramids are those little step pyramids in Sudan. That's what this symbolizes with the children of Moses.
Yeah.
The Danites.
Okay, now before we talk about the 40s, we better take a break. Yes, and time is running so quickly. Gosh, Rudy, we've got a lot to cover here with our guest, Gary Gianotti, Historical Anomalies in U.S. Symbolism and Stewart Freemasonry. Check out the dozen photos of the anomalies we're talking about on Facebook on 21st Century Radio Facebook page. We'll be back in just a few minutes.
Howdy, this is Joe Mars, journalist and author of Crossfire, Alien Agenda, Ruled by Secrecy, and you're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus. You know, a mind is a terrible thing to waste, so pay attention.
Oh, he plays a nice violin. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio with our guest Gary Gianotti, and remember, historical anomalies in the U.S. Symbolism and Stewart Freemasonry is what we're talking about. But check out the dozen photos of the anomalies we're talking about on Facebook on 21st Century Radio's Facebook page. Okay, Gary, now that you have set an identification standard of the silver and oval Indian peace medals that you talked about last segment, And the forensic scientist, Dr. Joseph Baraby. I sure would like to know more about him. He sounds like he's really something. Now, you say the top authorities of the past 100 years have all overlooked the fact that the most important metals are apparently silver-plated over copper. What is the dating of the copper telling us?
Well, this is the neat thing. A good friend of mine, David Fegley, real genius. He's a real special scholar. And one of the things we're able to do now is once we get to the copper, we can actually do a testing that will tell us what exact copper mine it came from.
That's
it could
great.
be sorry, go ahead.
No, that's great. Is
Yeah,
it usually up in Michigan, isn't it? Is that where
Well, there's Michigan mines there, a couple, one in New Jersey, Philadelphia, they were in Vermont, and then the main ones were coming from Sweden and from South America.
Oh.
So because of they can actually now date them. You can write to the exact date and say, hey, this is period metal, and that's it. It's game over.
Oh,
Just
yeah.
like that
Yeah,
now.
that's
Simple.
That's a great thing to have accomplished, in my opinion. Now, this is important to our interpretations of American history because, as you say, British citizens living in America at the time of the Revolution would have chosen a side king. We touched on this. But tell us a little bit more about this side king before we go into the next.
Basically, you had the ruling family of the Stuarts, going back to Queen Elizabeth and Mary Queen of Scots and her family lines. The Stuart males become these kings from the 1400s on, and they would hold titles like the Duke of York and like Charles I and Charles II, who were important pieces in there. Charles was beheaded, the first king to be beheaded, and Charles the second was holding the title, the Earl of Ross. The Earl of Ross, and you have clan members that are high-ranking lords in each clan. Betsy Ross's husband was one of these titled men. Grandfather came to America. The minister sold the titles that they had, and he had no rights to it. So when you hear that story about the circle with the Betsy Ross flag design, that is actually real. That's the real deal because that's the symbolism of the snake that eats its tail that represents the Stuart Charles I and II, and with Freemasonry.
Yeah. Well, before we talk about the 47 clues you found in many places, tell us about what's called Stuart Freemasonry. Just touch on this because I don't want to get into much detail on it.
I'll be short on this one. So early on, the early Stuart kings back into the 1500s were behind the creation of Freemasonry. Some of the records going back in Scotland, the oldest known records existing. They were the ones that chartered the different lodges and created it. And when they were at wars with each other, their own families, King George and his wife was a Stuart daughter that they exiled the real kings, the original kings. And then the later kings that were exiled were going around and using Freemasonry as a tool for secret operations and secrecy and going around all of Europe. And the last Bonnie Prince, the last prince that wanted to be king, he went in exile for 2 years spreading the word in Freemasonry. And he's supposed to be the one that brought back Knights Templar. And then we get the Knights Templar in the military history coming into America all the way from Nova Scotia to Boston, Pennsylvania.
Why is the number 47 significant to Stuart Freemasonry?
Well, it's when you become a Mason, you become a Master Mason, right? That's when you become a Master Mason with the York Wright. They use this. It's a sacred geometry symbol. So it's the symbol of the Euclid and also jewelry that a Master Mason used with the geometries, these different little squares, 3 different mathematical symbols that they wear as their actual jewelry. And so with this mathematics, you can do anything and everything. You could build a tunnel at one end and meet yourself at another end. So you can use this mathematics for anything. So it's the symbol that represents a Master Mason, but in this case, a guild artist Master Mason. It's identification to that.
Now, you say the designer of the Great Seal of the United States intentionally placed at least 200 or more 47s in the design. What was this supposed to represent?
My honest belief is that was intentional so that it would never be mistaken if you knew what you were looking at.
Mm-hmm.
And it's simple once you look at it. And I had to go all the way back into time, go into the 1790s, or actually the 1800s, go back in time in the study. Once I learned about the 47 on guns, and then going back to the piece metals, and then from the piece metals to the pyramid. So they did cross hatching. So that's all the shading on the steps. Those little checker shading.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at it and you tilt the pyramid to the left, each step going from top to bottom is cut with 47s. And there's literally 200 on one side or more. You flip it on the other side, and to the right side, that it's on its side again. Then there's another 200. So it's like 400 to be honest, or more. It's pretty wild.
We have an example of that on our Facebook page, I understand. My boss tells me.
It's on there, yeah.
Now,
and it's been overlooked because it's been overlooked forever. The conspiracy theorists talking about Freemasons being involved. Well, first time what was that?
I was going to say, you know as well as I do, most of the people that are talking about this really haven't done their homework.
Sure.
And, they're just taking it from a conspiratorial point of view. And you go well beyond that to get to the truth of these things. And that's the really key. That's one of the reasons why we need to have people like you on, because for decades, you and I have watched the bastardization of important information.
Sure. Yeah. Just like when they talk about olive branches on the Great Seal, they're not olive branches. Those are laurels. Laurels would be wrapped up, and that's what a Caesar would wear on his head. Remember Washington in the portraits wearing laurel, right?
Sure do, yeah. Now,
so when it's wrapped, it's unfinished business. That's what the laurel represents.
Now, this is a big deal, of course, because Great Seal conspiracy theorists have long claimed the designs of the U.S. Great Seal were Masonic symbolism, and historians could never prove any Masonic involvement in the designs. Why do you say this has changed?
Why has it changed as of now?
Yeah.
Well, it's the study of the art now, and these guild artists that were being taught from these schools of these artists as well. You have to look at all this art that they were doing, millions of pieces all the way in the last couple of hundred years, millions, famous paintings, everything. They always do twists in the art and everything from coins to paper money, paintings, engraving, stone art. And all this is overlooked, and it's if people could wake up and start seeing this art from the way that I see it, and some of the other people that I know, you're able to create a new value of all these treasures that we have in our country that are devalued.
Now, you've spotted 47s and other famous works of art that are linked to the Master Masons, such as Colt and Winchester firearms and the Norman Rockwell. Please elaborate on this.
Sure. So, Robert Scott was this Great Seal Guild president in the United States. So imagine him as this Union president sent here from Europe. He's controlling all the art and everything that's being done. He has a guild right over everybody. So he becomes, after Joseph Wright, who was making these medals, died in his first year at the Mint, yellow fever in Philadelphia, 1793, big epidemic. He becomes the great engraver of the U.S. Mint, and then he's allowed to start a company, the American Banknote Company. So that company exists today. They make your credit cards, the chips, the little plastic swiper. They're anti-counterfeiting devices. That's what a lot of this art is used as, anti-counterfeiting device, this oddball art sometimes that we find a lot of it in the art. But these gun guys are all related to families directly to Germany and to France and to Scotland. And they're brought here. It's meant to be that they come here and their families with a right. And then here they are going and working for these banknote companies, building their skills. And then here they are. They become the gunsmith, gun engravers for making guns for some of the most famous people on the planet, the most elaborate engraved art. And so they start using the symbolism. A lot of the times they'll take the buffalo's legs. They'll take a horse rider, the horse, his feet cross the legs and do these 47s. Norman Rockwell did it on the stagecoach. It's a famous painting he did for the anniversary of Winchester. And you'll look at all this. He's got so much art that has esoteric art within the drawing. It's just mind-blowing. And most people that are, I'm a Norman Rockwell expert, and and buy them and sell them all the time at some famous auction house, but they don't even know it's on the art. They don't even realize he was a 33-degree Mason. One of the highest Scottish Rite Masons.
Sure. Wow.
So I was able to take that history study and then go back into it, and then we started to find, my associate and I started to find this art, 47s and everything, on all the metals. Some of the great seals, but they're pressed and worn. It's hard to see if there is with the images.
Yeah.
But for sure, in the drawing that we're looking at, that is as authentic as it can be. And so prior to the great seals, I haven't done major in-depth studies, but I don't see a lot of the 47s after. So it's really around the time of the creation of the great seals by 1779. All the way into the 1910s and 20s and 30s, these artists are doing it. But it was mainly the gun guys, because these are the guys that are making money for foreign countries, too. They're actually engraved money for Russia, Argentina. List goes on.
Thanks for pointing that out. The hidden art engravings on the firearms led you to look for other leading Masonic Guild artists in Philadelphia from George Washington's time and search
so I went back in time.
For more 47s, then this led you to those peace medals we were talking about earlier, right?
Correct. Do
you want to add anything more to that part?
Sure. The very first medals of the 1789s have Minerva with the Indian with the pipe turned down. They're not really shaking hands. So this was the first design. And on the back, you have the bird, rising up. And on those, they were doing these 47s and checkering throughout the different wings. So there were multiples. Same. And then the 1792s had a totally different change. And it's George Washington there for the first time shaking hands with the Indian. And as we found them on them, it's on at least 6 or 7 of the most important ones that I know in the museums. They're identical in weight and size. And you'll see the same design. They'll cut the nose and then put the 4 off of it, and then add a couple more 47s off to the side of the head, and then they'll do them in the ground effects. So it was just fascinating to be able to find this and to say, hey, this is a way to identify an authentic medal from a fake one. But even though maybe in the 1850s and 60s, there were guys making these for Wild Wild West shows. I'm sorry, after, like Buffalo Bill's show, right?
Yeah.
1880s.
Sure.
So after, there were so many fakes made, and that's why there became such a problem with identifying real ones from fake ones. It's that was the biggest thing, is that so many they're the most faked medals known to exist. And so the interesting thing is, if I see some of these ones that are done by Masons that get the art, that are guild artists that did do them, the ones that are solid silver may not be real. Yeah. So it's the ones that are the copper, plated, silver plated over copper, or the real deal.
Yeah, I never would have guessed that. I never.
Yeah.
No. Well, while working on the peace medals, you discovered that the first unofficial engraver, you touched on this a little bit earlier here, named Joseph Lovell Wright Jr., was connected to Benjamin Franklin. How so? Would you tell us more about that?
Yes. His mother was this famous sculptor, artist, first one in America, and she was in the king's court. Her daughter supposedly married King George's son, one of the bastard sons. Don't mean to use the word in a negative way, but that's who he married. And he was a teacher, an artist teacher with the famous artist Benjamin West. Wright goes to school in this famous London Fine Arts Academy. From there, she gets in trouble after a few years being there. She gets in trouble for sculpting King Charles' head, or has his head watching while he's sculpting King George and his wife's heads. People saw this, and she got in a lot of trouble. So she had to send her son away to get him out of there to make sure he was safe. So she was Franklin's spy, and she sent him to France, and he was there for over a year. And Franklin was a master of this famous lodge called the Lodge of the Nine Sisters.
Oh, yeah.
And this is where the big money comes from, with all it's science and arts lodge. And so all these famous, rich, wealthy, they're Scottish exile mix and French and you name it. And their symbolism was adopted straight from the Grand Orient Grand Lodge in France, which was founded by Charles II in the early Civil Wars, who was exiled for a short period before he went back and took the throne again. And that was the history where I showed the snake on the medal, the circular snake eating its tail, which is exceptionally important. And that was discovered and proven by documents that art was done by the clubs, which were the Loyalist clubs from the 1680s and 90s. And then in 1710, this famous Oxford librarian antiquarian, Thomas Hearne, he documented these books. They would have their day books for their clubs. And on the covers, they would have this symbolism of the snake eating its tail, representing the sovereign connection to God, the king's royal link. So, you know, when we see the old pennies in America, the chain link pennies, right?
Yeah,
13 chain links.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing.
It is.
It's a link to God. And they adopted that symbolism directly off of this.
I learned a great deal from that standpoint. I really appreciate it. Do we need to take that break? Yes, we need to take a break here on 21st Century Radio with our guest, Gary Gianotti. We're talking about historical anomalies in the U.S. symbolism and Stewart Freemasonry. And again, check out the dozen photos of the anomalies we are talking about on Facebook on 21st Century Radio's Facebook page.
Hi, this is Steve Boone, bass player of the Class of 2000, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee, The Lovin' Spoonful, and you're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob.
Thank you, Uncle Steve Boone down there in Florida, and I hope you're doing better than everybody else is down there. He was going to be coming up north, but I think he better stay home. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio with our guest, Gary Gianotti. We have very limited time, but I want to go back to the Nine Sisters Lodge. Why is the snake biting its tail significant? And we covered that, of course, but the Nine Sisters Lodge being founded by the exiled Stuart king. Could you talk to us about that, please?
Well, it was the Grand Orient Grand Lodge of France founded that then gave the charter to the Nine Sisters Lodge. And Franklin was one of the first masters of the lodge, and they were adopting the symbolism of the snake eating its tail as a reminder of who they were all associated to with being loyal with in reality, which was they were loyal to the Stewart families. Mm-hmm. So even though it was the 1776, 7 when the lodge was created, they were still using this symbolism going all the way back because there were multiple civil wars from the 1650s with the Stuarts all the way into 1745. It just never ended. The symbolism evolved, and then it evolved into our adopted symbolism.
Now, I believe you just touched on the smoke cloud from Washington's peace pipe and the number 9.
Yeah. Well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, tell us more about that.
Well, the number 9 is no question of a doubt. It was a hard one to figure out here, and we've seen it on a couple other medals, and we see it on this artist Joseph Wright's paintings. He'll do them on buttons on jackets of other members like Houdin, the famous French sculpturist. He was there. He was a member, and so. The symbol there is representing, being that it's got the punch mark, Joseph Wright. We searched, my associate and I, for months and months and months trying to find out where was Joseph Wright made a Mason. He had to be. Well, it doesn't exist with all the Grand Lodges. He had to have been made a Mason when he went to France, when he was there with Franklin. And so he adopted it. And their whole motif design of the 9 sisters, they're the 9 goddesses of arts and sciences.
Yeah, they sure are.
And that's the big thing, the arts and sciences, the creation of schools and art. That's one of the big things with the founding of the United States. So he definitely put that art in there and shown that he's a master mason from the 9 lodges, and here's his initials. Now imagine sitting there trying to talk to some of these coin experts, and they're going to sit there, they'll be in denial.
Yes, of course.
But the point is, you can't fake it. And once the metal's already zapped and tested and done and dated, well, who in 1792 was the most important person with George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Franklin? He was put there to do this work, but then he dies. And then, remember how we talked about Robert Scott having to come in and engrave? They had to put him in place because they didn't have anybody else. There were a group of artists working together, but to be the number one guy, and you got to remember, he was a part of the most important art school in London. You know, it's one of the most important schools in Europe for the Fine Arts Academy.
Indeed.
And that's why he was chosen, because it wasn't just doing coins or metals. It was paintings and castings and sculpture. So he's just very talented, and there's very few examples of his work surviving. And we found I found quite a bit of a lot of pieces that are out there, and they're actually affordable to buy. And
when you say affordable, what kind of general ballpark figure are you talking about?
There were some small paintings that were sold in shadow portraits. They're $900, $1,200. In reality, when you look at these close and see the art in there, it's just mind-blowing. The hidden art that's on these. Yeah. These things are worth, tens of thousands of dollars. The metals, some of these metals, the last one sold for $700,000. Well, imagine if it's Joseph Wright, but not just him, but the very first official hand-engraved medals of the U.S. Mint of the 1500 that were thought to have been made. Think of that one.
Yeah.
So, people have paid $12 million for the most important silver dollar just a couple years ago.
Well, they would pay $12 million for Jimi Hendrix's shoe.
Oh, yes, they would. His guitar, too.
I know. I shouldn't have brought that up, but I couldn't help it. Now, many have conjectured that the eagle on the Great Seal is supposed to represent a phoenix bird. Would that be another link to rebirth of the House of Stewart in America?
Correct. It absolutely is. So the last prince that attempted to take back the throne, there was a song written about him, about the phoenix, his birth song, being reborn, and he's going to be brought up, and he's going to be the savior of England, Scotland, and Ireland, and become the king and kick out the House of Hanover, the Hanoverians, which is, they're direct cousins. So, yeah, the link with the bird, Mary Queen of Scots, she was doing embroidery work of this. A lot of it was tied into to many of the artists of their families. But in this case, it was adopted even on engravings done by associated artists, the Royal Scottish engravers associated to Scott back in England or Scotland. They were doing the prince's portraits and engravings, and you'd see the phoenix, the helmet done up as the phoenix, and other motif art similar, or the Medusa. They had a lot of symbols. The acorn tree is another one, a butterfly. They had many symbols that if you were caught with these pieces doing glass toasts, engraved glass king over the water toast, having these Jacobite glasses, you'd be executed. It was treason.
Now, before we run out of time, I am so excited about what you have to say about the American flags. You also have a theory about the meaning of the stars in the circular pattern on one of the earliest American flags. Now, I happen to believe that the flag was designed by Francis Hopkinson, but it is more commonly known as the Betsy Ross flag, based on a legend started by her grandson over 100 years after she died. You say the circular stars represent the snake biting its tail, you touched on that a little earlier, and therefore the supporters of the Jacobite king. What led
Correct.
You to that conclusion?
Correct. So the circle's a link, and we know this as a fact because we're able to track down one of the neatest subjects that I love are the historical buttons. The jacket buttons that are the size of like $50, right?
Yeah, they're handsome, all right, no doubt about it.
The rattlesnake buttons that eat its tail, and then you have the 13 stars, and you have that symbolism there. But then there's older ones that have been misidentified. They have the stripes, then they have the chain links. These are going back before the Revolution, up to 30, 40, 50 years before some of them. And so we know that this confirms this art, and the art by Hearn is documented. So everything to do with Freemasonry, when we see this snake eating its tail, which represents Charles II, the return of the king, his link is sovereign royal link to God. That's what the symbolism. Charles, when he was the prince before he became king, held the title the Earl of Ross. The same clan, Betsy Ross's husband, never even knew he was a lord. He never knew it. His grandfather told him that he sold the titles, and the person that had his titles did send him a letter prior to the American Revolution. So that's your link right there with that. But when you go back, remember the Grand Union flag that was flying over in Massachusetts? Washington raised it first, right?
Certainly. That really was our first flag, wasn't it?
It's our first flag. So what you're seeing there is you have two sides. That's just a basic evolution of a flag that belongs to the Stewart family to begin with. The red and white stripes. What do these colors represent? Not blood, not purity. It represents the two houses, the House of York and the House of Lancaster. You know the War of the Roses, red and white, right?
Right, sure.
So that's their families. That's who they're intermixed and married with. So that's what I believe the symbolism for the red and white stripes. But it doesn't matter the pattern design of the stars. It doesn't matter. And the reason for that is because it all means the same thing. And this was when I did the big Webb horn study where the flag was being done by a famous engraver named Webb. And he was doing this battle scenes going on at Boston and then showing the flag designs that were just oddball with 7 stripes and not 9. And these guys were accurate artists. But in this case, it doesn't matter what the star pattern is. It's all the same thing, and it represents the Jesus and the 12 apostles, the king who's the ruler with his 12 knights. The 2 orders, one in Scotland and England, he ruled them both, and both orders of knights that ruled the realms. And basically these orders, with the 13, they were even making shields for each one of them in the 45 war, 1745 for the Bonnie. And they had all different types of motif that associates symbolism with other flags, like the Medusa head with the circle, like the Cowpens flag.
Yes.
With the circle and then the stars on the outside, the 12 on the outside. That's the same. That's what this represents, this art symbolism. So it doesn't matter what the pattern is. It's the same thing. And this is documented, this history if you go to the Queen of England's website right now, and they talk about this. So and when he would wear the blue sash that represents the order with the big star in his chest. Mm-hmm. Remember Washington wearing the blue sash?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Same stuff, similar history.
How long have you worked on this particular work?
The flags, the Great Seal, and all this. I would say at least a good 30 years. 30
years. How much money have you made by it?
Not much.
$1.50 or something like that. You are very, very dedicated to this country. Could you tell me why?
Well, the problem I believe today, if you look at what's happening, one big thing is this lack of education, and it's just everything's crazy. But what's a country with no identity? A person that has amnesia. Who are you if you don't know who you are or what you are? You're pretty much nobody. You're nothing. Mm-hmm. And we've lost that. We are losing that with a nation that's divided.
Well, with what you're saying, we didn't even get there. I mean, we hardly even started because we didn't understand where.
You want to hear a crazy one? Can I just
Sure.
tell you a real fast one? And I'm not trying to be racist, or it has nothing to do with this.
Okay, go ahead.
The DNA was done with the most important bloodlines of the direct descendants of the Stewarts, the most important living guy of the families, done 2 years ago. So you get these people burning these flags and stepping on them, all these crazy groups, whatever, right?
Right.
They don't even realize that this king, his actual DNA proven today, he's from Africa. The Stewarts are African. These Stewarts specifically, and this history, symbolism.
How interesting. That is truly fascinating.
Sahara Desert.
Well, I got to congratulate you on getting it done. It must have been hell And sometimes, I mean, because I don't know how you can afford to do all of that.
Well, now it's time to write it up, Bob, and I could put it to rest and say, these challenges are done. I mean, this is the first time that it can be said, as factual as fact that the identity of the United States can be factually restored.
We're about out of time, but you got a publisher.
I'm working on it.
Do you need one?
Yeah, I sure do.
I'll try to get you one. But we're about out of time this hour right now. And I'll get back in touch with you. Our guest, Gary Gianotti, Historical Anomalies in U.S. Symbolism and Stewart Freemasonry. He is making history about this country, and I think you should pay attention to it.